Much of the reason that we're here today is to experience firsthand the momentum of change that is transforming our state, and learning how a variety of evidence and data-based informed practices can advance the status of health equity across Oklahoma for folks with uteri, because we understand that everybody that has a uterus is not necessarily a woman, like myself. Those of us who deploy the reproductive justice framework in our daily lives are so busy doing the work that we might not think about how we've arrived here. Putting theory into action is not an easy task, but in the decades since the civil rights era, we find ourselves in an environment where community-centered knowledge that community organizers show us is the standard we are all striving to meet. And community organizers and icons like Loretta Ross are responsible for setting that standard. So Loretta J. Ross is an associate professor at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, in the program for the study of women and gender. She teaches courses on white supremacy, human rights, and calling in the calling out culture. Sorry. She has 2 honorary doctorate degrees from Arcadia University and Smith College. Loretta's activism began when she was tear gassed at a demonstration as a first-year student at Howard University in 1970. As a teenager, she was involved in anti-apartheid and anti-gentrification activism in Washington, D.C. as a founding member of the D.C. Study Group. Loretta has a history of social justice activism that spans 50 years, and she retired from community organizing in 2012. In that time, she was the national coordinator of the sister song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective from 2005 to 2012, and co-created the theory of reproductive justice in 1994. Loretta was a national co-director for the March for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C. on April 25th, 2004, one of the largest protest marches in US history. She founded the National Center for Human Rights Education in Atlanta, Georgia. She launched the Women of Color program for the National Organization for Women, NOW, in the 1980s, and was the national program director for the National Black Women's Health Project. Loretta was one of the first African-American women to direct a rape crisis center in the 1970s. She was then able to launch her career by pioneering work on violence against women as the 3rd executive director of DC's Rape Crisis Center. She is a member of the Women's Media Center Progressive Women's Voices. Loretta has co-written 3 books on reproductive justice, including Reproductive Justice: An Introduction, and her newest book, Calling in the Calling Out Culture, which is coming out later this year. Loretta is a rape survivor, forced to raise a child born of incest, and also a survivor of sterilization abuse at the age of 23. She is a model of how to survive and thrive despite the trauma that disproportionately affects specifically low-income women of color. Loretta is a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother. The one thing left on her bucket list left to do is to see Venus and Serena Williams play tennis live. She's an avid pinochle player, which is a hard game. I had to look it up. But competing in tournaments across the country, because this is how she balances her activist life with an apolitical hobby, because we know that if we cannot take care of ourselves, then we cannot show up and take care of community. So I am so lucky and so thankful to be able to introduce your keynote speaker, Loretta Ross.
Thank you, and congratulations, Representative Turner. I taught about you in my class. And so,
thank you.
Yes, so it's such an honor to get a chance to meet you, because I talked about how politics was transforming as our demographics change. America's becoming younger, browner, queerer, everything. And we've got all of these angry white men who don't like it. And that's what we're all up against. But if you don't mind, I just will use a phrase that I learned. They're pimples on the butthole of time. And so we will see to their demographic fate as it should be, because they can't stop time. Um, I'm here to talk to y'all about reproductive justice, but I can't talk about reproductive justice without talking about the consistent criminalization of Black women's bodies, because that's the crucible of which reproductive justice was born. Of course, since the enslavement, Black women have always tried to control our reproduction because we were forced to breed as a wealth building strategy for slave owners and really for white America, whether they were slave owners or not, because you didn't have to own a slave to profit from slavery, as many historians have documented. Even though a lot of white people think, well, I didn't own a slave, my family didn't own a slave. Well, we can have a whole nother conversation about that. But America's wealth was built on the genocide against indigenous Native American people and the enslavement, and particularly the forced breeding of Black women. But after 1865, of course, at the end of slavery, Black women sought to control our own fertility. And as a matter of fact, W.E.B. Du Bois did a sociological study early in the 1900s where he proved that Black women had cut our fertility rate in half. And that was quite a decade before Margaret Sanger began her campaign for birth control. And so, in doing the research, what I found is that Black women had brought to America from Africa many knowledges around abortions, around contraceptives, around fertility management. And they began to use these things both during the enslavement as a way to deny slaveholders uh, the right to raise and sell their children, but also they particularly began to use it after the enslavement ended. And if you look at the Black women's newspapers or articles at the period, particularly Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who wrote in 1892 that all women are not intended to be mothers. And that was a very oblique demand for the use of family planning and birth control. And then also at the beginning of the 19th century, you had the pressure put on white women to breed to fulfill the manifest destiny. So you ended up with the Comstock laws of 1873 forbidding the transmission of information around birth control. And that was to put pressure on white women, but they also wanted to pressure Black women not to breed because they tended to describe our progeny as a drain on the country after 1865 as a reason that crime has grown, the crime rate, the environmental destruction. I mean, we've been hearing this stuff for hundreds of years. And so the criminalization of Black women's bodies is what we saw when we formed the theory of reproductive justice in 1994. I was lucky enough to have been one of the 12 women who created this theory. It turns out that we were at a pro choice conference in Illinois in 1994 when a representative of Bill Clinton's administration came to persuade this largely feminist pro choice conference to support healthcare reform, which was under the leadership or the stewardship of Hillary Clinton. And we politely heard out their proposal. And one of the things that struck us, the entire 200 plus attendees at this conference, was that they had decided to land on a strategy by basically omitting all references to reproductive health care in healthcare reform because they thought that would lessen the Republican opposition to the bill. I guess you can tell how well that worked out because Republicans have been implacably opposed to providing health care for the American public for decades. And so it didn't really work out. But what occurred to us as the 12 Black women of the 200 attendees at this conference was that why would they omit reproductive health care and then expect a feminist conference to support it when reproductive health care is the main driver of women to the doctor. I mean, your first on becoming a woman moment is your feet up in the stirrups. I mean, what are they talking about? Why would they promote such a male centric healthcare plan and expect the feminist movement to back it simply because they're Democrats? And so we met in the room of, I was told, because I don't specifically remember this, State Representative Abel Mabel Thomas, which I can believe because Abel Mabel's always getting us into trouble through her good trouble with her leadership. So I believe it probably happened in her room. And we tried to decide what we were going to do about this absurd plan of omitting reproductive health care from healthcare reform. We all came from all different organizations. Some of us worked at Planned Parenthood, some of us worked at the Black Women's Health Project, some worked at uh, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. I didn't even work at a women's organization my time at the time. I worked at the Center for Democratic Renewal, formerly known as the National Anti-Klan Work Network. But I had done so much work on reproductive health and rights by that time that that's why I was invited to attend the conference and was funded by the Ms. Foundation to go. And so, because we represented all these different organizations, we didn't actually have permission from our organizations to use their names to do anything. And so, we first started thinking about why abortion rights was always isolated from social justice issues. Because whether or not a person chooses to have an abortion is directly dependent upon the circumstances in which that person finds themselves. So if that person doesn't have access to health care or economic security or housing to put the child in, or is subjected to violence in their lives, whether it's immigration violence or interpersonal violence or racial violence, all of those things affect one's reproductive decision making. And if you have good answers to those human rights questions, then an unplanned pregnancy will be turned into a wanted pregnancy. But if you have bad answers to those human rights questions, then even a planned pregnancy may be turned into an abortion. And this is where people actually make decisions about their lives. So to so what we did was take reproductive rights and social justice and smash those two terms together, or splice them, as they might say in some industries, and we coined the term reproductive justice, which is a human rights way of embedding all discussion around reproductive decision making in a human rights framework. And then, because we needed to place an ad in the Washington Post, which is going to be our strategy using this new language, we had to call ourselves something. And so we landed on the certainly awkward name of Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice, uh, because we wanted to be inclusive not only of African American women, but African immigrant women and Latina immigrant women who identified as Black, and so on, so on, so on. Fortunately, by the time we got to the ad in the Washington Post on August 16th, 1994, the Black Women's Health Project has said, we should just name this Black Women for Healthcare Reform and not have to explain all of these different gradations of our thinking that we had went through in that historic night. And so we did place the ad in the Washington Post, as I said, on August 16th, 1994. We simultaneously placed it in Roll Call, which is a congressional summary, a magazine for people that's happening in Congress. Maxine Waters led our press conference at the National Press Club. And that's where reproductive justice was born. The concept lay dormant, though, after that. I think WADRI, the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice, we wrote a couple of letters in our name to support Jocelyn Elders, who was under fire by the Clinton administration for mentioning masturbation, because you weren't supposed to say those kinds of dirty words, apparently, if you were the Surgeon General. And then to also support, I believe it was David Thatcher, who was replaced after her from Morehouse School of Medicine. But the concept of reproductive justice lay dormant for 3 years until Sister Song was formed in 1997 with a grant from the Ford Foundation. 16 women of color organizations came together to form the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Health Collective. There were 4 Native American, 4 Latina, 4 Asian Pacific Islander, and 4 African American groups of the 16. And I was one of the ones that was involved in that founding. And we spent our first years as Sister Song building our capacity because most of us were kitchen table operations. We didn't even have, paid staff or websites. Most of us didn't even own computers or fax machines at that time. So we spent a patient amount of time building our capacity so that we could actually not just burn out all of our founders, not have our organizations come and go. Because Sister Song, I should add, was the fifth attempt to establish a national coalition of women of color working on reproductive health rights and justice issues. And the others had floundered for lack of capacity building and lack of foundational and funding support. So we decided to do it differently this time with the fifth attempt. And we spent a lot of time building our capacity, doing trainings with each other on establishing boards of directors and financial management systems and training on human rights education and self-help and nonprofit board development and things like that. And so by 2003, we decided to go public with what we had been doing. And I had decided at that time, as one of the founding members, to road test the concept of reproductive justice as the glue to build this emerging movement of women of color working on reproductive health issues together. And so I assembled a panel of leading women of color from across the spectrum and asked them, do you think reproductive justice is a viable concept for us to build a new movement with? And the 600 participants, which are just women of color as well as our white allies, resoundingly said yes. So reproductive justice took off after that because it was like a public debut of the concept. And then next thing we know, Now has started talking about reproductive justice in its newsletter by the end of 2003. And then the March for Women's Lives was coming up, which was originally called the March for Freedom of Choice. But we had persuaded them that in order to get Sister Song's participation in the march, as they had been asking, and they meaning the Feminist Majority Foundation, the National Organization for Women, Planned Parenthood, National Planned Parenthood Federation, and NARAL Pro Choice America, if they wanted women of color to participate in it, first they had to change the name of the march because the March for Freedom of Choice makes it only about abortion. And we were using a much larger theoretical, conceptual, and practical framework. And so they chose an older name, the March for Women's Lives, which sounded fresh to people because they hadn't remembered the marches from 20 years before that were also called the Marches for Women's Lives. I actually wanted it called the March for Women's Human Rights, but that was a little forward looking for the people. And and so I became the March co-director along with Alice Cohan from the Feminist Majority Foundation. And we ended up attracting 1.15 million people. And so that would be the formal national debut of the concept of reproductive justice. And I've been astonished by how this framework that we created by centering Black women in the lens in that hotel room in Chicago ended up being such a transformative framework because that wasn't our intent. We were just trying to describe what we needed from healthcare reform, but it ended up really having an impact across the world. And just let me start closing by saying it was really important for us to define for ourselves what reproductive justice is, and by centering ourselves in the lens. And so at the time that we defined it in 1994, we decided that every woman should have the human right, first of all, to have the babies, that she wants to have, if she wants to have them under the means by which she wants to have it. So that's the human right to have a child. And that means to have your own birth plan respected, to be able to use a midwife or a doula, to refuse an unnecessary cesarean section or whatever. But we also join with the pro choice movement in fighting for the second tenet, and that is the right not to have a child. And that means you use things like birth control, abortion, or abstinence, if you could hold on. Uh, there's a theory called abstinence out there. And so that's where we overlap. But again, where we somewhat depart from from both the pro-choice and the pro-life movement is with our third tenet, and that is the right to raise our children in safe and healthy environments. And that speaks back to what I was referencing earlier, the population and the eugenic strategies that were visited on Black women. And that brings us into conversation with things like gun control and safe environments and taxation policies and lack of affordable housing and how gerrymandering is stripping us of political representation and all of those things that are not normally seen as affecting reproductive decision making, but in fact do. And then in 2012, a new iteration of reproductive justice emerged, the fourth tenet. And that was mainly by the LGBTQ members within Sister Song, who said, first of all, we should not be so womb centric, that we really should talk about the right to sexual identity, gender identity, and sexual pleasure as a human right that's also part of reproductive justice. And so currently, reproductive justice includes all four tenets. That includes both female identified people and non female identified people, men, GNC people, LGBTQ, on and on. And so it turns out that it's an elastic, capacious framework that is eminently adaptable, because I've seen, the indigenous community talk about reproductive justice through the lens of sovereignty. I've seen uh, a portion of the Latina community talk about it through the lens of immigration rights and stuff like that. So really, we love the fact that we accidentally on purpose created this wonderful framework that people have embraced around the world, in Ireland and South Africa and Latin America, in Asia, everywhere around the world, people are fighting for their reproductive human rights. They're using the reproductive justice framework. And so I'm a bit awed by that, because we had no idea we were going to be setting the world on fire and really marginalizing the concept of the artificial binary of pro-choice, pro-life, with a framework that was capacious enough to include both. And I'll close by saying one of the things people don't recognize, that the founders of Sister Song were both pro-choice and pro-life. It's in our DNA to build a container to hold both of those perspectives. And so our pro-life founders, co-founders, were the ones that would say, well, I wouldn't have an abortion, but I wouldn't stop you from having one. And that's a pro-life position that the pro-choice people could unite with. And so we never fought on over abortion within Sister Song, because we built a loving container big enough to hold a diversity of opinions. And that's why reproductive justice is embraced by both the pro-choice and the pro-life wing of the movement, even though we try to caution people that it's a criteria-based framework. If you're not talking about human rights, if you're not connecting local issues to the global issues, and if you're not centering the most vulnerable people in the lens, then it's not reproductive justice, because it's not an identity-based framework, but a criteria-based framework that uses intersectionality to determine what people's vulnerabilities are, so that we can make sure we attend to those vulnerabilities as a way of helping people achieve and protect their human rights. So let me shut up, because I probably went over time, and see if there's any questions that people have to ask me.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Ross. I'm just going to be helping facilitate some of the Q&A just so folks know to ask questions. You're just going to use that raise hand feature, and then we'll work to unmute you and you'll say your question aloud. So we'll give some folks a minute to collect their thoughts. Thank you so much for all of your words. I loved what you said about that tenacious elasticity of the reproductive justice framework. That's really permeated through the years. I'll just ask up front while we give people a moment to collect their thoughts and raise their hands. Um, Acknowledging, I know you're in Atlanta, Georgia, which we've seen, right, some political shift in that state. And we're here in Oklahoma in this conservative context in which these conversations, as we kind of talked about at the start of this conference, can be, right, there's can be so stigmatizing and can be so challenging to have in some of these, like our legislative spaces, et cetera. Do you have any, I guess, advice to give or things you've seen work in these kinds of contexts when it comes to having these conversations with folks who may, when it comes to the reproductive justice framework, not embrace it whatsoever?
Well, we had a significant legislative victory in 2010. And like Oklahoma, we have a red state legislature here in Georgia. But the anti-abortionists started a billboard campaign here in Georgia, basically claiming that when Black women choose to have abortions, we're committing self-genocide. I think the lead line of the billboard is Black children are an endangered species or something like that. So it wasn't just a billboard campaign, but they were trying to pass uh, a race and sex based ban on abortion as part of the campaign. They're called PRENDA bills, Prenatal Non Discrimination Act, which is the federal level bill that anti abortionists are always trying to claim, push. And then, of course, we ended up with the state PRENDA bill. And it 2010 was not a good time for the pro-choice movement legislatively, but we Black women took charge and formed the Black Women and Sister Song took charge and formed a coalition to fight the state-based Prenda bill. And that was very necessary because it was such a racially directed anti-abortion strategy that the Black women had to lead on this. I mean, there was no question. And thank God that our partners with NARAL and Planned Parenthood and other white-led reproductive health and rights organizations understood that we needed to be a step up and we needed to be out front, as well as Asian American women, because there was a gender-based component of the bill. Now, just to bottom line it, we defeated that legislation. We were one of the few pro-choice victories of 2010. We defeated it. But it was not only our working strategically to defeat it, because we had to first identify who was sponsoring this legislation, who had sponsored the billboard, and in a sense discredit them by juxtaposing them against leading Black figures like Martin Luther King and W.B. Du Bois and Mary McLeod Bethune, who supported family planning. So basically saying, you're going to listen to them or you're going to listen to people you know, kind of thing. And then secondly, we had to talk about why women, Black women, were getting abortions. And trust me, there's never in history been a Black woman who sought an abortion because she was surprised her child was going to be Black. I mean, this just doesn't happen. And so their whole premise didn't make sense that women are choosing to abort babies because they're Black. I mean, what are you talking about? Unless you have this fear of interracial relationships. And if that's your problem, you need to say so. But to condemn all Black motherhood because you got some anti-miscegenationist fears is a bit duplicitous. And then the third thing we had to do was pivot and and we created the phrase trust Black women to know how to make the decisions that are right for ourselves and our bodies. And so that was our offensive campaign. But what worked in our favor was the war within the Republican Party because their hardcore people were absolutists. They said, we want it to pass. We don't want any exceptions. We don't want any compromises and whatever. And they ended up alienating the more moderate Republicans who ended up not voting for the bill that the Republicans had wanted to pass. And we see echoes of that civil war in the Republican Party happening now. But it was obvious to us in 2010 that this civil war of the hardcore ideologues was just going to end up Trumpifying, even though Trump hadn't come on scene yet. But the hard right of the Republican Party was taking over the party. And so we benefited from the disarray amongst the Republicans, but also the leadership, the multiracial leadership of the coalition to make sure that we discredited the authors of the billboard and the legislation. And like I said, in 2010, we defeated them. And so that's where reproductive justice works as a strategy legislatively. You have to do a strategic analysis of who your friends are, who your opponents are. We had to call out our state NAACP because that male, the head of the NAACP was a man who hadn't consulted with his female base before he ended up joining the antis. And we had to call him out, and he had to make a public apology in the newspaper to walk back his words and stuff. So we worked very strategically with our coalition partners, and we worked very intersectionally because the leading Asian American organization in our city was a domestic violence organization called Raksha. So we had to make sure that they had the time to participate in our coalition work without sacrificing the fragility of their existing organization. And so, but we knew how to do that as Sister Song. So that's what we did.
Thank you. It's so good to hear a legacy of work like that we can build on and learn from. We had someone anonymously submit a question that I'll ask real quick, and I'll remind folks that the raise hand function's at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen, and you can click that to get unmuted and ask your question directly to Loretta Ross. But so someone asked anonymously, if you could expand on the difference in a justice framework and an equity framework. Which I know that you may see those things as going more hand in hand, but I thought it was an interesting question.
Well, there is a relationship between justice and equity. Some people might see them as synonymous. I call myself a justice feminist because I tend to knit together reproductive justice, environmental justice, economic justice, health justice, food justice, education justice. All of the things that I care about have as their core not only making things equal or equitable, but also remedying past harms and preventing future harms. That's what justice brings for me that equity doesn't, because equity assumes that your goal is to equalize things and stabilize things so that no discrimination exists. But it doesn't address past harm, nor does it always prevent future harm, where a justice framework is not time bound. It is, and really, my mother, Texas woman that we're, because we're all from Texas, by the way, just to the south of y'all. She used to quip all the time. Why would I want to be equal to men when I've been superior to them all my life? She just said it as a joke, but I don't necessarily want the same miserable health care that is given to white people. I want better. I don't want the same miserable working conditions given to white people. I want better. And so the equity or the equality framework leaves my desires somewhat short. I want justice, not only in terms of everybody getting quality health care, but everybody being held accountable for the harms of the past, as well as preventing future human rights violations in the future. But there's no reason you can't interchange justice and equity. I just like to use a longer time horizon in my analysis of what I want.
Thank you. We have more folks typing questions. You all are being shy with the raise hand feature, but these are good questions. So thank you so much for submitting them. So someone asked, beyond voting and promoting reproductive justice legislation, what steps would you recommend for young folks to take to advocate for reproductive justice?
Well, there's a couple of things that are imminent right now. With the tilt of the Supreme Court, which is increasingly hostile to abortion rights and reproductive justice, we're going. we're only a couple of votes away at the Supreme Court level from having to reestablish an abortion underground, where we help people raise funds to get to state to where abortion is still protected at the state level, where we're going to need lawyers of courage to defend us who are trying to smuggle in the abortion pills or smuggle people out to get an abortion and stuff like that. And so if you want to do some real frontline work, start preparing yourself for running an underground railroad, because that's so obviously in our future. And that's beyond voting and beyond lobbying. We have to make sure people don't die. That's what we've always done as a feminist movement, to be on the front lines to ensure that people don't die, regardless of what the government, what the church, or what our individual partners say. And so it's really important to be creative. So if you're headed towards law school, become a lawyer of courage and know that you're going to be dealing with some cases of people who are trying to be on the front lines. If you want to get into healthcare, learn all you can about midwifery and doulas so that you can actually be there and be a birth to death doula, so that you help people come into the world and you help them leave it too, kind of thing. There's a lot of creative things you can do other than lobbying and legislating. All of that is necessary though, because there's many paths up to the mountaintop. No one path, there's no such thing as one path.
Thank you so much. Oh, and we have folks raising their hands. Brandy, could you help me unmute Jenna Chapman, who has her hand raised?
Hi, Jenna.
All right, she is unmuted.
All right, Jenna, I think you just have to unmute the mic on your end and you're good to go. Oh. Looks like we might be having a bit of technical difficulty. I'm so sorry.
It looks like we also have a question from Tommy, so I'm going to unmute Tommy as well.
Okay, Jenna, make sure you unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Tommy.
Woohoo! Okay. So my name's Tommy. I had a question real quick. So we work within an absolutist state legislature here in Oklahoma, and that can drive wedges between different women's health groups, especially those affiliated with state agencies, as no one wants to seem too radical. And this makes organizing really hard in Oklahoma. So I know you may touch on this later in your masterclass, but what advice do you have for organizations committed to reproductive justice while maintaining politically neutral status?
Each one of those situations are situational. I think you have to first be firm in what you believe in, and so that someone can't flip you from believing in those things, but at the same time, you need to be strategic. You need to realize that the people you need to build power with will not be in 90% agreement with you, because that's a very small coalition. You're going to need to build power with people who are in 75% agreement with you. For me, I'm a 90% feminist who defends abortion rights, but for me, a 75%er may be someone in the Girl Scouts who supports women's and girls' empowerment, but they're not going to send the troops to the clinic to defend them, right? And then the 50%ers are people who could go either to the left or the right. And so the 50%ers may be someone like my conservative parents. My mother didn't believe in abortion or birth control, but she believed in her daughters. And so it depends on how I spoke to her, how I framed it. For example, my mother started a Black Girl Scout troop in San Antonio because we weren't allowed to go to the white Girl Scout troops because of Jim Crow segregation. And every weekend we had to feed hungry people because that was the way we earned our merit badges with mom. And so when mom was trying to figure out what I was doing as a human rights activist, she used to get really confused. She said, I've got a son who's an architect, and I've got another son who's a pharmacist. And Loretta just doesn't go to jail too often, because she couldn't describe what a human rights activist did. And I overheard her saying that one time. I said, wait a moment, Mom, do you remember how we fed those hungry people? And of course she did. I said, well, you feed the hungry, and a human rights activist asks why they're hungry in the first place. And that way I spoke to her values, showing her that I was manifesting them in a different way. So with the 50% people, that's what you need to do. Speak to their values, even if they land in a different place about what to do about them. So they may not openly support reproductive justice, but you may be able to speak to them about people's right to control their own bodies, how unfair it is for people to have to juggle so much work, life, children balance, and why should the government be in their bedrooms telling people what to do, those kinds of things. So you can't just react to the fact that they're not in 90% agreement with you. You can actually use them to build your power base to go on by going underneath those values. Because the worst thing you can do, by the way, is to neglect them and have them be recruited by your opponents. Because that's why they're called 50%. They can go either to the left or the right. And so our job is to make sure that we include and build them in our base by speaking in a register that they can hear and not the 90% register we might prefer. So when talking to a 50%er, I may never mention the concept of reproductive justice because that may be a 90% term, but I'll speak about the values of having safe places to raise our children and gun violence on the way to school and whether or not people should have clean water to drink and stuff like that. And then if you keep it strategic, you won't have problems building your power base.
I was just taking notes. So we're gonna come back to Jenna in a minute. I know we're still working on questions there, but we have Omari Jimerson who had her hand raised. Omari, can you unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello, Loretta. You and I met probably about 7 years ago. I was pregnant with my son, so I'm assuming that was the time, at a ACN conference. And I was preparing for a presentation at the NAF conference where I was going to be speaking about, it was around the time when we were seeing all those billboards pop up in Black communities concerning abortion. And so I spoke with, oh my goodness, his name escapes me now. Anyway, at the NAF conference, you connected me with great women like Dorothy Roberts. But around that time, you had mentioned to me you were doing some research, which I think you may have talked about a little bit during your talk around Margaret Sanger, and that you were going to be releasing a book. And I just got so enveloped in all of that, when all the books that you gave me, that I was just looking forward to that. And I wanted to know, has that been released, or and did I miss it, or is that something that's still coming?
It's something that's still coming. I started in 1992 writing a book called Black Abortion because the story of Black women's engagement with abortion has been undertold, in my opinion. And I started it as an organizer because my job was to mobilize Black women to support abortion rights. And yet I found that many of us didn't know our history. And so I started that book. I've been working on it off and on, but then the problem with that book is that there's not a publishing contract on it, whereas I keep getting offered deals by for other books. So since I started Black Abortion, I've co-written 3 books on reproductive justice. I've got this 4th book called Calling In the Calling Out Culture. And so I keep back shelving the one that doesn't have a publisher for the ones that do. But I have, and actually I offered to prioritize my manuscript on Margaret Sanger when Planned Parenthood was celebrating its 100th anniversary. But they've historically flinched from an open and honest discussion about Margaret Sanger, so they even refused to return my calls till I got a little mad at them, and then they talked to me and said, "Oh, we think not." But at the same time, I do believe that we need to be able to tell the truth and shame the devil, as we say. Margaret Sanger was a complicated woman who did great things, and she also said some very problematic things. But every human being does that. Every human being does that. And so why we can't tell the truth instead of over valorizing her or over criticizing her is beyond me, because she did some great things and then she did some problematic things. But that just proves she was human. But the way that PPFA flinches from telling that honest story, well, it's on them. But I am going to get back to Black abortion, hopefully before I die, because this is the longest pregnancy in the world since 1992 to now. I think that's next year will be 30 years I've been nurturing this book. But I've released large portions of it in magazine articles and journals. So if you Google my name, Loretta Ross, with African American women in abortion, you'll see some shorter pieces that I've written on the topic.
So much, and thank you for the question, Omari. We're going to go to Jenna now with her question. Go ahead, Jenna.
Hi, Loretta. Sorry about before. I was having some technical difficulties.
It's all right.
Can you talk about community organizing? How would you recommend bringing folks into this work to help organize and prepare for the eventuality of fulfilling these underground services that you had referenced earlier?
Well, community organizing has a couple of methods you can use, and which one you choose really is dependent on which one you prefer. Uh, I tend to prefer a values-based method, so that I like organizing with complete strangers where we can exchange values and we actually get to know each other and develop relationships because we do the work together. Other people prefer a relationship-based organizing strategy where you do the work with your family and your friends and your coworkers and your neighbors as a way to do community organizing. I don't think that there's anything wrong with either strategy. I prefer working with people whose hearts are in the right place and they're doing it for those reasons rather than they're doing it because they know me or I know them. Because that kith and kin system is limited. It kind of predicts that the only people you should care about are those who know you and those you know. Where I prefer the non-relationship organizing, where I want to work with perfect strangers because we share values. And then we'll get to know each other through the work itself. And the crucible of change reveals to you who you're working with. And so who you know in a safe, non-political environment may not be the same way when you're up against something hard and political or a difficult conversation. There's a lot of books on community organizing available. A lot of people have theorized about it, but those are the two ways that I see it. And I'm not saying it's a binary either, because I will organize people I know and I will organize people I don't know. I'm going to use different strategies for different situations.
Thank you so much. To go to a question someone typed in a bit ago, around if you could speak to the origins of Sister Song's statement regarding long-acting reversible contraception and IUDs in the arm implant.
Well, first of all, I don't think I've even read Sister Song's statement on IUDs. I lived Sister Song in 2012, and it is being wonderfully run by Monica Simpson, who I hired, and I love what she's doing, but I don't think I've read Sister Song's statement, but I can probably speculate what's in it, and you don't hold me wrong if I got it wrong, though, because I haven't actually read it. Um, but we've always been against population control, and one of the things a Black feminist theory says is that we're not against contraceptives per se, unless they're chemically dangerous, but we are against the social conditions that end up with certain contraceptives being pushed on vulnerable people, and particularly those that are provider dependent, where you have to go to the doctor to have them removed and things like that. And so, without seeing Sister Song's statement, I suspect it's echoing those values that we want a wide range of contraceptives available to people, and we want people to have the information necessary to calculate what risks that they're willing to endure, because there's no such thing as a perfectly safe contraceptive, but they have to have full informed consent in order to select the contraceptive that works for them. And so we've always critiqued population control and bad development policies where contraceptives are promoted in a context when you're not looking at what's going on in terms of the other social determinants of health. If I mean, why would you push contraceptives in a village that doesn't have potable water without stopping and asking why they don't have potable water? I mean, aren't you ignoring the big picture? And people can't, birth control themselves out of not having potable water. I mean, let's just look at this. And so when you push contraceptives into a situation of intentional underdevelopment, you end up being complicit with the underdevelopment instead of solving the underdevelopment, because it's not the women's fertility that is causing them not to have potable water. So it's a false solution for dealing with the perception of overpopulation. But I haven't seen the Sister Song statement, but I'd be surprised if they veered far from that analysis.
No, you absolutely touched on it and covered myriad topics within it. Thank you so much. And then we have a question. I think we may have time for one more after this. We'll have to see. Kimberly, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Thank you for everything you've said and done. I had a question in terms of when the Supreme Court changes rules regarding access to abortion. Is there one plan or a couple of plans where you think we should be looking in terms of keeping that underground access available? Because I've definitely seen a lot on YouTube and Plan C and all these different ideas out there. And I'm just wondering if you had ideas you personally could help us navigate and direct us in this direction.
The only plan that comes to me is what women have done for thousands of years, and that's talk to each other. Go back to those kitchen table conversations where you say, well, this is the situation now, but I happen to know this person, or I know this resource, or blah, blah, blah. I mean, when the world's a mess, just start sweeping up at your own front door. And so I can't come up with a more magical strategy for saying, have these conversations with the women and men in your own family, and within your own circle, with your own community, so that y'all can pool together the knowledges y'all need if and when a situation comes about. And that works not only on reproduction, but on violence against women, on childhood sexual abuse, all of those things. Is having we have to stop being afraid of having what we call difficult conversations and turn them into joyful conversations. And if you're young enough to still have access to your mother or your grandmother, have that conversation with them about how they manage their own reproductive decision making, and share with them what's going on within your generation and stuff like that. But be prepared for the fact that they're scared to have the conversation, so you might have to be brave for them.
Thank you so much for saying that. I know my grandmother's abortion story is something I'm so glad that I've had the privilege to hear. And you're right, it's just, as you speak to this values and relational need for coalition building, I'm just so thankful for your words there.